The first time I noticed something was amiss in my home, I brushed it off as paranoia. It was a Tuesday evening in late October, and I had just returned from a grueling day at the office. As I fumbled with my keys at the front door of my modest two-bedroom apartment, a shiver coursed down my spine, and I couldn't shake the eerie sensation of being watched. I stepped inside, flicking on the lights and scanning the living room. Everything seemed normal. My worn leather couch sat undisturbed, the TV remote exactly where I'd left it on the coffee table. Yet, something felt off. The air was heavy, as if the space had been recently occupied. Shaking my head, I chalked it up to exhaustion and made my way to the kitchen. As I reached for a glass in the cupboard, I froze. The dishes were arranged differently. I always placed the plates on the left and the bowls on the right, but now they were mixed together. It was a small detail, one that could easily be explained away by forgetfulness, but it nagged at me. Over the next few days, these little inconsistencies continued to pile up. I'd come home to find a window slightly ajar that I was certain I'd closed. My toothbrush would be wet when I knew I hadn't used it since the morning. The level of milk in the carton would be lower than I remembered. At first, I tried to rationalize these occurrences. Maybe I was more absent-minded than I thought. Perhaps I was sleepwalking. But as the days turned into weeks, the evidence became harder to ignore. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. My heart pounding, I lay perfectly still, straining my ears. The footsteps paused outside my bedroom door, and I could hear the faint sound of breathing. I wanted to call out, to confront whoever was there, but fear paralyzed me. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated, and I heard the soft click of the spare bedroom door closing. The next morning, I inspected the spare room. Everything looked untouched, but there was a faint indentation on the bed, as if someone had sat there. The closet door was slightly ajar, and when I opened it, I noticed that some of my old clothes were missing. I knew I should call the police, but what would I tell them? That I suspected someone was living in my apartment, using my things, eating my food, but leaving no concrete evidence? They'd think I was crazy. Instead, I decided to set up a hidden camera in the living room. I positioned it carefully, making sure it had a clear view of both the front door and the hallway leading to the bedrooms. With trembling hands, I activated the camera and left for work, my stomach churning with anxiety. That evening, I rushed home, eager to check the footage. As I reviewed the video, my blood ran cold. There, clear as day, was a stranger moving through my apartment. He was a tall, gaunt man with unkempt hair and ragged clothes. He moved with eerie familiarity, helping himself to food from my fridge, using my bathroom, and even watching my TV. But the most chilling moment came when he looked directly at the camera, a knowing smile spreading across his face. He walked up to it, his face filling the frame, and whispered, "I know you're watching. This is my home now, too." Panic overtook me. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but as I dialed, I heard a noise from the spare bedroom. Footsteps approached, slow and deliberate. The door handle turned, and I found myself face to face with the intruder. "Hello, roommate," he said, his voice raspy and unsettling. "I think it's time we had a chat." I stood frozen, unable to move or speak. The man before me was even more terrifying in person. His eyes were sunken, with dark circles underneath, and his skin was pale and waxy. He wore a stained t-shirt and torn jeans, both of which I recognized as clothes I had planned to donate. "Who are you?" I finally managed to stammer. "What do you want?" He chuckled, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Who am I? I'm the one who's been keeping you company all these lonely nights. As for what I want, well, I'm quite comfortable here. I think I'll stay." My mind raced, trying to process the situation. How long had he been here? How had he gotten in? And most importantly, how could I get him out? "You can't stay here," I said, trying to sound firm despite my trembling voice. "This is my home. I'm calling the police." His smile faded, replaced by a look of cold determination. I wouldn't do that if I were you. You see, I've grown quite fond of our little arrangement. If you try to force me out, well, let's just say things could get unpleasant. He took a step closer, and I instinctively backed away. What do you mean? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I mean that I know everything about you now. I know your routines, your habits, your fears. I know about the little illegal side business you run from your computer. How do you think the police would react to that information? My heart sank. He was right. I had been doing some questionable freelance work to make ends meet. And if that came to light, I could lose everything. So here's what's going to happen, he continued, his tone matter of fact. You're going to go about your life as normal. You'll go to work, you'll come home, and you'll pretend everything is fine. Meanwhile, I'll continue to live here. You won't see me much. I'm quite good at staying out of sight. But I'll be here watching always. I felt sick. This couldn't be happening. But as I looked into his cold, determined eyes, I knew he was serious. Why? I asked, my voice cracking. Why me? Why here? He shrugged. Why not? It's a nice place and you're rarely here. It's perfect for someone like me who needs to lay low for a while. The implication of his words sent a chill through me. What had he done? Who was he hiding from? Now, he said, clapping his hands together. I think it's time for dinner. You're going to order us some food, and we're going to have a nice, civilized meal together. After all, we're roommates now. And so began my nightmare. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. On the surface, my life continued as normal. I went to work, I socialized with friends, I even dated. But always in the back of my mind was the knowledge that he was there in my home waiting. He was true to his word about staying out of sight most of the time. But occasionally, I'd come home to find evidence of his presence. A dirty dish in the sink, the TV turned to a channel I never watched, or sometimes, a note left on the kitchen counter with unsettling observations about my day. I lived in constant fear, never knowing when he might appear or what he might do. I considered moving, but he made it clear that he would follow me wherever I went. I thought about confiding in friends or family, but the risk of him retaliating was too great. As time passed, I began to feel like a prisoner in my own home. I lost weight, developed insomnia, and became a shell of my former self. My friends noticed the change in me, but I brushed off their concerns with vague excuses about work stress. One night, about 6 months after he first revealed himself to me, I woke up to find him sitting at the foot of my bed. In the dim light filtering through the curtains, his gaunt face looked almost skeletal. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and serious. I sat up, my heart pounding. "About what?" "I'm leaving," he said simply. For a moment, I couldn't process his words. "Leaving? Why? When?" He sighed, running a hand through his matted hair. "Things have changed. It's not safe for me here anymore. I'll be gone by morning." A mix of emotions washed over me, relief, disbelief, but what to say? He was gone in the morning. The decision to move into a quaint, older apartment in the heart of the city was one I made out of necessity rather than desire. The rent was cheap, and its proximity to my new job was unbeatable. From the moment I stepped into the apartment, I felt an inexplicable chill. The landlord, a grizzled old man named Mr. Grant, assured me that the apartment had character and nothing more. Little did I know, I was stepping into a nightmare. The first few days were uneventful. I busied myself with unpacking and getting settled into my new routine. The apartment was small but charming, with vintage wallpaper and creaky wooden floors that added to its old-world charm. However, the initial excitement of moving into a new place quickly faded when strange things began to happen. It started with minor incidents. Misplaced items, strange noises at odd hours, and an overwhelming feeling of being watched. I dismissed these as the quirks of an old building and my imagination running wild. But as the days went by, the disturbances became more frequent and harder to ignore. One night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard a faint whispering coming from the hallway. It was so soft that I could barely make out the words, but it sent shivers down my spine. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The whispering stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I chalked it up to the wind or perhaps a neighbor's TV, though deep down, I knew it was something else. The following night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in my living room. I lived alone, so the thought of someone else being in my apartment was terrifying. I grabbed a baseball bat from under my bed and cautiously made my way to the living room. The footsteps stopped as soon as I entered the room. The living room was empty, but the air felt heavy, almost oppressive. I checked the locks on the doors and windows, which were all secure. Puzzled and frightened, I returned to bed, but sleep eluded me for the rest of the night. As the weeks passed, the disturbances grew more intense. Objects would move on their own, lights would flicker, and cold spots appeared in random places around the apartment. I began to dread coming home, but I had no other options. My friends suggested I find a new place to live, but with my limited budget, that wasn't feasible. I had no choice but to endure. One evening, I came home to find the apartment in disarray. Books were scattered across the floor, and furniture had been moved. My first thought was that I had been robbed, but nothing seemed to be missing. I called the police, who conducted a thorough search but found no signs of forced entry. They concluded that it was likely a prank or perhaps a case of sleepwalking. I knew better. Something malevolent was living in my apartment, and it wanted me out. Desperate for answers, I turned to the internet, researching hauntings and paranormal activity. I found a local paranormal investigator named Sarah who agreed to visit my apartment. She arrived the next day, armed with an array of equipment designed to detect spirits. As she set up her devices, she explained that older buildings often had residual energies that could manifest as hauntings. Sarah began her investigation in the living room, where most of the disturbances had occurred. She used a device called an EMF meter to detect electromagnetic fields, which are often associated with paranormal activity. As she moved around the room, the meter's readings spiked dramatically. She looked at me with concern and said, "There's definitely something here." She then set up a digital voice recorder to capture any EVP, electronic voice phenomena, and invited me to ask questions. Feeling foolish but desperate, I asked, "Who are you? Why are you here?" We waited in silence, the tension palpable. After a few minutes, Sarah played back the recording. At first, there was nothing but static. Then, faintly, a voice whispered, "Get out." A cold chill ran down my spine. Sarah suggested we try a spirit box, a device that scans radio frequencies and supposedly allows spirits to communicate in real time. As she turned it on, the room filled with a cacophony of static and broken voices. "Why are you here?" she asked again. The static crackled, and then a clear voice came through, "Leave now." The intensity of the message was undeniable. Sarah advised me to leave the apartment immediately and find a new place to live. She offered to help cleanse the space, but I could tell she was deeply unnerved by what she had encountered. Determined to get to the bottom of this, I asked Mr. Grant if there had been any previous incidents or history of the apartment. Mr. Grant was reluctant to speak at first, but after some coaxing, he revealed that the apartment had been vacant for several years before I moved in. The last tenant, a young woman named Emily, had disappeared without a trace. The police had conducted an investigation, but no evidence was ever found, and the case went cold. Mr. Grant admitted that strange occurrences had been reported by previous tenants, but nothing as severe as what I was experiencing. Determined to find answers, I delved into the history of the building. I discovered that in the early 1900s, the apartment had been a boarding house. There were rumors of a violent incident involving a deranged tenant who had attacked several residents before being apprehended and committed to an asylum. Some believed that his spirit still lingered, trapped in the place where he had committed his crimes. Armed with this information, I decided to confront the entity. I enlisted the help of Sarah and a medium named Claire, who claimed to have experience dealing with malevolent spirits. We gathered in the living room one evening, determined to cleanse the apartment once and for all. Claire began by lighting sage and reciting prayers, while Sarah set up her equipment. As the cleansing ritual progressed, the temperature in the room dropped, and the air grew thick with tension. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and a loud crash echoed through the apartment. The entity was making its presence known. Claire continued her prayers, urging the spirit to move on. The room grew colder, and we could see our breath in the air. The EMF meter spiked wildly, and the spirit box crackled with static. "Leave, now," the same voice commanded, but Claire stood her ground, demanding that the spirit leave. In a final act of defiance, the entity manifested before us as a dark, shadowy figure. It loomed menacingly, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. Claire held her ground, chanting louder and more fervently. With a final, ear-piercing scream, the figure dissolved into nothingness, and the room grew still. Exhausted but relieved, we sat in silence, absorbing what had just happened. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, and the apartment felt lighter, almost peaceful. Sarah and Claire assured me that the entity was gone for good, and I could finally live in peace. Or so I thought. A few nights later, I was awakened by a familiar sound, footsteps in the living room. My heart raced as I grabbed the baseball bat from under my bed and crept towards the source of the noise. To my horror, I found the living room in disarray once again, but this time, there was something new. A message scrawled on the wall in what looked like blood. "You can't get rid of me." Paralyzed with fear, I realized that the entity had never left. It had only been biding its time, waiting for the right moment to strike. The oppressive feeling returned, stronger than ever, and I knew that I was trapped in a never-ending nightmare. Desperate and terrified, I fled the apartment that night, leaving behind all my belongings. I moved in with a friend, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. Even now, years later, I still have nightmares about that apartment. I often wonder if the new tenants have experienced the same horrors, or if the entity is lying in wait, ready to strike again.